What if one of America's darkest chapters wasn't just history, but a warning? The Great Depression wasn't only a financial crash. It tore apart everyday life. Families lost homes, jobs vanished overnight, and food became scarce. It reshaped governments, fueled extremism, and left scars for generations. Today, the same patterns are starting to emerge. So, are we already living through the first signs of an economic collapse? On this episode of the Infographics Show, we're breaking down why the Great Depression still matters, and what it means now. The war to end all wars ended in 1918, an incredibly bleak time in human history. But it was followed by a surge of optimism, powered by electricity. In 1920, about 35% of American households had it, and millions more would soon join them. The roaring 1920s became an age of glamour, liberation, and risk-taking. The U.S., now the richest nation per capita on Earth, seemed unstoppable. With confidence sky high, investors poured money into new businesses. Automobiles rolled off assembly lines and into driveways. Middle-class families chatted on their new telephones. Crowds lined up to watch moving pictures, while the fashionables smoked and danced in jazz clubs. This was mass consumerism, and it felt good. For a moment, many Americans believed the old world of hard work and endless struggle had been left behind. But the good times couldn't last. Reckless speculation, easy credit, and the arrogance of bankers brought the whole system crashing down like a house of cards. Their actions pushed the U.S. and much of the world into an economic dark age. The fallout fueled extremism abroad, helping Adolf Hitler rise in Germany, and set the stage for World War II. It also vindicated the communists in Russia and their supporters in the West. It all started on October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. 16 million shares were dumped in a single day, triggering the Wall Street crash. The U.S. had been booming through the 1920s as ordinary people clamored for a slice of the new consumer pie. Businesses desperate to cash in ramped up production. But there was a problem. A huge portion of Americans couldn't afford the goods being made. Warehouses filled with unsold goods, pushing down wages and widening the wealth gap. This created a vicious cycle. From the outside, America still looked unstoppable, at least for a while. Tales of ordinary people turning small bets into fortunes filled the headlines. Regular Joes rushed into the stock market, and bankers, never ones to pass up a gamble, poured fuel on the fire, handing out loans to keep the frenzy going. The recipe was simple: borrow, buy, wait, sell, cash out, repeat, and retire young with your feet up. But by late 1929, the reality was setting in. Stock prices had shot far beyond the actual value of the companies they represented. Add in some panic selling and the bubble turned into a wobble. The wobble became a stampede, and the stampede ended in financial carnage. As shares collapsed, the banks tried to stop the bleeding. They bought up millions of them, hoping to restore confidence in the market. But the money they used wasn't theirs. It belonged to their customers. So, when the market kept sinking, the banks were left with tons of almost worthless stock, and their customers were left with, well, nothing. The great guardians of capitalism had just set fire to the nation's savings. The banks went under, and millions of Americans lost all their money. At the Bank of the United States in New York, 400,000 depositors saw their money vanish. And that was just one bank, out of nearly 9,000 that failed. In total, close to 40% of U.S. financial institutions collapsed. Businesses also failed, and mass unemployment skyrocketed. The vicious cycle of broke consumers and closed businesses gradually tore apart the fabric of the U.S. economy. In 1929, 6 million Americans were unemployed. By 1932, that number had exploded to over 12 million, about a quarter of the entire workforce. Industries ground to a halt. In some cities, unemployment rates were over 50%. The poorest people were hit the hardest. They had no safety net, no social welfare state to catch them when times were hard. If you lost your job, you lost your home. Your savings vanished. And in the worst cases, children died young from diseases linked to malnutrition. With 25% of working-age Americans out of work, countless families simply had nothing at all. For many Americans, the Great Depression was like a kick in the teeth. Just over a decade earlier, 2 million men had been sent to fight in Europe, and almost 116,000 of them never came back. That war was supposed to usher in a brighter age, the Progressive Era, a time of modern democracy and prosperity. Now the soldiers and their families were down and out. In the summer of 1932, some 43,000 demonstrators, veterans, their families, and allied groups marched on Washington. They were demanding their service bonus certificates, even though they weren't due to be cashed in until 1945. The veterans set up camps, but the police rushed them with truncheons and tear gas. Shots rang out and 2 protesters were killed. Then came the army. Infantry, cavalry, even tanks rolled in. The camp was left a wreck, tents burning and dozens injured. During the 1928 campaign, Herbert Hoover struck an optimistic tone, promising a brighter future. A self-made millionaire in mining and business, Hoover believed deeply in laissez-faire economics. Let the system sort itself out, he argued. Don't interfere with banks or business, and prosperity would return on its own. He believed rugged individualism was the way forward, rejecting what he saw as a nanny state. Even at the height of the Depression, he insisted that relief for the poor should come from charities and local communities, not Washington. But while Hoover preached self-reliance, unemployment soared, and Americans lined up for hours just to get a bowl of soup. Still, he tried. In 1929, Hoover introduced the Agricultural Marketing Act. This created the Federal Farm Board, which bought up surplus crops and kept farmers afloat. But the plan backfired. With guaranteed buyers, farmers churned out even more, driving prices down further. Instead of saving agriculture, it only deepened the crisis. And in 1930 came the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. This raised tariffs on more than 20,000 imported goods. The idea was to protect American industry and force people to buy American. Instead, other nations retaliated with tariffs of their own. U.S. exports collapsed, and by 1934, global trade had shrunk by almost 2/3. American farmers and manufacturers, who had once relied on foreign markets, were financially crippled. In 1930, Hoover set up the Emergency Committee for Employment, urging states and businesses to hire. By 1932, he pushed through the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, funding some public works. But the programs were weak and underfunded, often aimed more at shoring up banks and railroads than feeding hungry families. By the time bread lines stretched across every major city, Hoover's name was tied to poverty and desperation. Shantytowns were dubbed Hoovervilles, and empty pockets turned inside out became Hoover flags. At street level, few Americans felt Washington was doing anything to halt the collapse. With no help from the top, ordinary Americans began to organize. Faith in the system hit rock bottom, fueling leftist labor movements that unsettled America's elite for the next few decades. In 1931, in Seattle, the Unemployed Citizens League was formed. It spread quickly to other cities, recruiting tens of thousands of members. They formed self-help cooperatives, pooling what little they had. Together, they gathered food, clothing, and firewood to survive. Soup kitchens sprang up across the country, funded by churches, charities, or sometimes even gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago. Homelessness wasn't new. Before the Depression, it mostly meant single men left behind by the system. But now, entire families were pushed onto the streets. The income of the average American household fell by about 40%, and in just 1932, over 273,000 families were evicted. They built makeshift shantytowns. Kids with dirty faces played in the mud while their parents hunted for food or day labor. Anything to get through the week. Walls were scavenged wood, roofs patched with scrap tin, insulation stuffed with rags, paper, or cardboard. About 70% of Hooverville residents were poor white Americans. And they now lived side by side with African Americans, Native Americans, and migrants from Mexico and Central America. More and more people began to wonder if the Soviets had it right, if communism might work better than capitalism. But most Americans, even left-leaning intellectuals, had little idea of the brutality inside the Soviet Union. The Depression wasn't just about poverty. It was about losing faith in the government, in capitalism, and the future itself. That loss spread worldwide, dividing societies. People turned on each other when they needed solidarity the most. The country was forced to pay crushing reparations, give up territory, and dismantle its military, debts worth hundreds of billions in today's money. By 1929, Germany relied heavily on U.S. loans. When Wall Street crashed and America demanded repayment, the German economy collapsed overnight. By 1932, 6 million Germans, at about 30% of the workforce, were unemployed. Into this chaos stepped Adolf Hitler, a man who, in the late 1920s, had been dismissed as a fringe loudmouth. His rants about failed capitalism drew only small crowds in 1928, when the Nazi Party scraped just 2.6% of the vote. But as Germany hit rock bottom in the early 1930s, his message of national revival began to resonate. By July 1932, the Nazis had 37% of the vote, making them the largest party in Germany. Hitler promised jobs, food, and above all, national pride. That made him useful not only to conservative German elites, but also to powerful interests abroad who feared communism like the devil. Major Western banks and corporations in the US and Britain invested in and traded with Hitler's Germany, not because they missed his extremism, but because they saw profit in a bulwark against communism. Soon, the world was calling Germany the land of an economic miracle. The darker sides of Hitler, his anti-Semitism, brutality, and fanaticism, were brushed aside in the West. All that mattered was that he seemed to stand firm against the Red Menace. So, the Great Depression laid down a red carpet for political extremists to walk onto the scene and make promises. That's how fragile the system was. Desperate people do desperate things, especially when the system seems rigged against them. And here we are in 2025, following two of the greatest transfers of wealth from poor to rich the world has ever seen. The people trusted the banks back in 2008, and then they found out they'd made serious mistakes. And as the blood was still drying, the house of cards collapsed again, this time in the pandemic. For many, the system felt rigged. Trust in government is at an all-time low. Trust in the media is just as bad. More people are dying young from diseases they shouldn't have. For the first time on record, U.S. life expectancy is falling. Stores are closing week by week, and in poorer neighborhoods, the ones that thrive are payday lenders, pawn shops, liquor stores, and charities. According to the UBS Global Wealth Report in 2023, the richest 1%, millionaires and billionaires, own nearly half the world's wealth, about $214 trillion. Meanwhile, almost 40% of the world's adults have less than $10,000 to their name, and together they hold under 1% of global wealth. The world's 26 richest billionaires now hold $2.87 trillion between them. In the U.S. alone, the number of billionaires jumped from 751 to 835 in 2024. At the same time, ordinary families were crushed by soaring rents, food prices, and medical bills. In some places, the gap is even more extreme. In South Africa, the richest 10% control about 80% of all wealth. And in India, the richest 1% now own over 40% of the nation's wealth. This isn't the Great Depression. But extreme inequality is becoming a pattern that's impossible to ignore. Between March and December 2020, while the world reeled from the pandemic, billionaire wealth rose by $9 trillion. In the same months, global workers lost $7 trillion in earnings. According to the OECD in 2024, over half the world's people say they have little or no trust in their governments. The same report found that nearly a third believe people cannot be trusted. That meant anyone. The UN has warned that this points to a systemic breakdown in social cohesion. But here's the problem. Politics is consumed by endless fights over race, sex, and identity. These debates matter, but when they take over, the focus on economic security disappears in the noise. Social media and partisan outlets only pump up the anger, pushing polarization to new extremes. Today, 87% of Americans say political division is a threat to the country, and 86% feel drained by it. The imbalance works just fine for those at the top. Divide and rule has always kept people from uniting over money and power. Politicians know how to exploit economic fear. And in the US ads, some elites lean on identity politics to look progressive, while dodging harder questions about class and inequality. Many of the world's biggest corporations wave the flag of progress in their PR campaigns, while dodging taxes, outsourcing jobs, and paying sweatshop wages. Back in 2012, the Tax Justice Network estimated that $21 to $32 trillion in private wealth was hidden offshore. That's about 20% of all global wealth, out of reach. Governments have also talked the language of progress while pushing privatization and deregulation that widened the gap. To some, that's not progress. It's a smokescreen. On the other side, conservatives step in with promises to save the country or restore tradition, often by finding scapegoats. But they rarely touch economic inequality. Instead, it's tax cuts for the rich, culture wars of their own, and blind faith that the market will sort itself out. The result is inequality that keeps growing, and it's only expected to get worse. In one Pew poll, 73% of Americans said that by 2050, the U.S. will be more unequal. Only 20% thought family life would improve. With so much pessimism and polarization, it may only take one more disaster or just the cost of living grinding people down before more people turn to extreme movements. Others may simply give up, refusing to vote at all. And some will sink into what doctors call deaths of despair, a number that surged over the last decade. Dr. Luke Kemp at Cambridge's Center for the Study of Existential Risk studied the collapse of over 400 cultures across 5,000 years. Many fell because they were taken over by oligarchs obsessed with wealth and status, people who enriched themselves while neglecting ordinary people. their riches never trickled down. And in time, their societies ate themselves from the inside. Some critics say we're living in an age of hyper-individualism, where community and meaning get lost in the rat race. Even art and culture, once seen as humanity's crowning achievements, often feel like cheap products, made to sell instead of to inspire. Dr. Kemp warns that elites drain wealth from the people while turning them against each other. They strip the land, tax citizens to fund wars that benefit only the few, and eventually their societies crack apart. In the past, collapse sometimes led to renewal, but today, in a global system armed with nukes, hooked on fragile networks, and trapped in shifting power struggles, collapse could mean something far worse: the end of civilization. Maybe it's not quite that bad. Every era has had its doomsday fears. Still, if inequality keeps rising, if trust keeps falling and polarization deepens, the road ahead could be bleak. Faith in the system, in security, stability, and shared culture is at historic lows. And that's a warning no society should ignore. If history really is repeated,